Welcome to This Explainer. All right, we're taking a pretty fascinating journey back in time today. Let's completely step away from our screens and modern comforts for a few minutes and drop right into rural New England nearly 2 centuries ago. We're going to explore the daily life of the Zachariah Hildreth family in 1834, living in the small farming community of Townsend, Massachusetts.
It's kind of the ultimate time machine prompt, isn't it? What was daily life actually like back in 1834? Just imagine waking up in a world totally removed from our modern conveniences. Literally no electricity, zero indoor plumbing, no quick trips to the grocery store down the street. Everything you ate, wore, and used had to be grown, crafted, or traded for by your own 2 hands. So how did a family not just survive, but actually build a life, a community, and a home in that kind of environment?
To figure that out, we really need to ground our data in humanity. Let's meet the parents at the center of our story. We've got Zachariah Hildreth, who is 51 years old in 1834. He's a settled farmer and a cooper who's lived in township his entire life. His wife, Hannah, is 44, and together, they were the absolute anchors of a bustling, incredibly complex household economy.
Okay, let's dive into this with Section 1, Meet the Hildreth Household.
Think about the sheer span of ages and responsibilities they had under one single roof. You've got James at 17, and he is essentially acting as a full farmhand right alongside his father. Then there's Clarissa at 14, already deeply involved in heavy domestic work. And that cascades all the way down through 12-year-old Elizabeth and 10-year-old Milo to 6-year-old Moses and little 3-year-old Edward. Just try to picture the bustling, noisy reality of this house. You have a teenager doing the heavy lifting of an adult right alongside a toddler just getting totally underfoot. And Hannah was managing this entire spectrum of childhood while keeping the entire household running. Now, you might be wondering, is James the oldest? Actually, scratch that. The eldest son was Aaron. He had married Sophia Adams the year before, in 1833, and established his own household nearby. This shrinking of the household was a super common pattern back then. As older children reached adulthood, they eventually left to start their own farms and families, which naturally made room for the younger siblings to step up into those more demanding roles.
Let's move to Section 2 and see how this builds, the rhythm of labor.
Survival in 1834 was absolutely a year-round job. We noted earlier that Zachariah was a farmer and a cooper. Now, if you're not familiar with the term, coopering is the craft of making barrels, casks, and buckets. And this wasn't just some side hobby. This dual identity was vital. Think of barrels as the cardboard boxes of the 19th century. You desperately needed them to store your cider, salted meat, and grain. By being a cooper, Zachariah could actually keep producing valuable goods inside the barn during the slow, freezing winter months when the fields were frozen solid. And that brings us to the agricultural calendar, which literally dictated everything. It was this ongoing, relentless story of Zachariah and 17-year-old James battling the seasons together. Step 1, spring planting. Getting the corn, rye, and potatoes into the ground. Step 2, the exhaustingly hot work of summer haying. Step 3, that absolute critical rush of the fall harvest, trying to get the crops in before the first frost hits. And finally, Step 4, winter, where the focus shifted indoors to coopering, cutting firewood, and mending tools. There was basically no true off-season for these guys.
But while the men battled the fields, the women sustained the home. It is so crucial to realize that a 14-year-old girl like Clarissa wasn't just doing light chores. When you contrast the male labor with the female labor, it's pretty eye-opening. Hannah and her daughters were spinning and weaving cloth, sewing, preserving food by drying and salting it, making butter and cheese, and of course raising the younger kids. Clarissa's domestic labor alongside her mother was quite literally about survival. Without their relentless work, the family simply wouldn't have clothes to wear or food to eat through the winter. It's that simple.
Let's shift gears a bit. Section 3, Minds and Souls.
With all that intense labor, you might be thinking, did they have time for anything else? Well, Massachusetts actually had a really strong tradition of public schooling, but it had to fit the reality of farm life. District schools in Townsend were scheduled entirely around farm labor. They'd only open for a matter of weeks in the dead of winter, and then briefly again in the summer. So James, Clarissa, Elizabeth, and Milo squeezed in reading, spelling, and arithmetic, often using the famous New England primer, but only during those exact windows when they weren't desperately needed for planting or the harvest.
And this brilliantly illustrates a really important key point about this region. The historical records show this family valued education for daughters just as much as sons. In fact, later census records show a younger sister, Harriet Augusta, attending school too. This was very consistent with broader Massachusetts norms of the period, which boasted remarkably high female literacy rates. Education wasn't just a luxury reserved for the boys. It was considered essential for everyone, even if it meant squeezing it in between farm chores.
Outside of the schoolhouse, the other great pillar of life was the church. The Congregational Church stood right at the very center of spiritual and social life in Townsend. Now, Sunday worship was definitely a deeply held religious obligation for many, but practically speaking, it was also the primary anchor of the week for the community. It was the one guaranteed time you would see your neighbors, catch up on news, and maintain the entire social fabric of the town.
It's also super important to understand the broader social landscape of the 1830s. Social reform was heavily in the air back then. A big one was the rising temperance movement, which advocated for reducing or totally eliminating alcohol consumption. And a lot of rural churches were swept right up in it. Now, we don't have exact records showing whether the Hildreths themselves took temperance pledges, but they were absolutely surrounded by these cultural debates. Meanwhile, local governance happened at town meetings, where male taxpayers like Zachariah would gather to vote on community issues. It was a highly engaged society.
All right, Section 4, 1830s Rural Entertainment. So up to this point, it might sound like their lives were nothing but backbreaking work, solemn church services, and serious town meetings. But no way, that's simply not true. Because the work was so hard, they literally turned work into parties. Just imagine the smell of the fall harvest at a husking bee, where neighbors gathered to strip corn husks, and the young folks could do a little flirting. Women had quilting bees and sewing circles to socialize. Town militia musters were basically town-wide festivals. They had huge Thanksgiving gatherings. And imagine the sound of sleigh bells in the winter. Snow actually made the roads easier to travel, allowing young adults to head out to singing schools. Honestly, those singing schools were basically the 1830s version of a dating app, just disguised as hymn practice.
Let's bring things back down to a more intimate level for a second. For the youngest family members, little 6-year-old Moses and 3-year-old Edward, daily fun didn't require organized social events at all. It just meant simple play, a massive amount of outdoor freedom on the farm, and of course the time-honored tradition of getting completely in the way while their mother and older siblings tried to work. It's a really wonderful reminder of the simple, universal joys of a rural childhood.
So, what does this all mean for us today? I want to leave you with this final thought. How does our modern separation of work, community, and play compare to the deeply integrated life of the Hildreths? Today, we commute to our jobs, we drive somewhere completely different for fun, and we schedule our social lives digitally. But for Zachariah, Hannah, and their kids, work, survival, socializing, and family were all woven into one single, unbreakable fabric. It was a challenging life for sure, but a profoundly connected one. Thanks for joining me on this look back in time.